Okita caught her eye and gave her a stern look. He opened his mouth, presumably to reprimand her, when
貴様ら浪人か。主取りなら判明を答えろ。
The cry went up from one of the Shinsengumi soldiers, and Okita turned, his mouth tightening into a thin line.
ああ、よりにもよってこんなところで騒ぎを起こすなんてね。
His hand dropped to his sword as he ran toward the commotion. Townsfolk screamed and ran like leaves before a gale. In the sudden press of fleeing citizens, she found herself pulled away from Okita. For a moment she panicked, but soon realized that perhaps it was best. If she'd stayed close, he would have been forced to keep half his attention to her. She didn't want to distract him, so she ran to a nearby alley to watch. Once the situation was resolved, she could make her way back to the first division.
坊ちゃん、そこの坊ちゃん。巻き込まれんよう、うちの店へ入りや。
She paused for a moment. A strange man was inviting her into his store. Not strange on the face of it, perhaps, but she had been warned many times to be on her guard. She was about to politely refuse when she realized which store it was. The one the man earlier had pointed to. He nodded.
キエモンさん、このガキさっきまで新選組の起きたと一緒にいたぜ。
What?
新選組だと逃げろ。
There was a mad scramble for the door, and in moments, the store was empty of customers. True, she had been accompanying the Shinsengumi, but the reaction of the store's customers seemed excessive.
君って本当に運がないよね。ある意味こいつらも僕もだけど。
He gave a small, unconcerned shrug, and leapt through the door of the shop. Masu's exploded with the sounds of swordplay, with men swearing and scrambling across furniture for position. What on earth had just happened? When they returned to Shinsengumi headquarters, Sanan had a number of words for them. They weren't particularly pleasant. They had been kneeling for some time as the colonel berated them before Okita finally spoke up.
そんなに怒ることないじゃないですか。僕たちは長州の患者を捕まえてきたわけだし。
When the fight was over, they discovered a massive arms cache and confiscated the entire thing. No one had bothered to explain to her what was happening, however, and she was utterly lost.
怒ることではない。沖田君は面白いことを言いますね。増や喜右衛門と身分を偽っている人間は長州の患者である古高俊太郎だった。我々新選組はその事実を知った上で彼を泳がせていた。違いますか？
その通りですけど、でも捕まえるしかない状況だったんですよ。
His excuse was weak, and his petulant frown suggested he knew it.
ま、宗司の言う通り、ある意味では大手柄だろうな。
でも古高を泳がせるために頑張ってた島田君や山崎君に悪いと思わないわけ？
The corners of Heisuke's mouth twitched into a momentary smile. Shimada interrupted before he could continue.
東堂君の気持ちもありがたいが、我々のことは
あまり気にせんでください。私らも古高に対して手詰まりでしたから、沖田君たちが動いてくれて助かりましたよ。
Yamazaki nodded in silent agreement.
古高捕獲はすでに済まされた事柄です。その結果に不満を述べるつもりはありません。
お前ら首相な奴らだね。それに引き換え掃除は。
It didn't look like Nagakura was going to let Okita get away without thoroughly rubbing his face in his mistake. At last, she felt she could remain quiet no longer.
"君への監督不行き届きは誰の責任ですか?"
He glared at her, his eyes hard and angry, and she felt her throat dry up.
一番組組長が監視対象を見失うなど、まったく情けないこともあったものですね。
When she'd first met him, Sinan had been nice, if a little quiet. After his injury, however, it was as if he'd become an entirely different man.
外出を許可したのは俺だ。こいつらばかり責めないでやってくれ。
Sinan looked up as Hijikata walked into the room. He gave the commander a tight, wry smile, but only got a peaceful, impartial glance in return.
土方さんが来たってことは、古高の拷問も終わったんですか?
Hijikata didn't so much as blink.
風の強い日を選んで今日の都に火を放ち、あわよくば天皇を長州へ連れ出す。それが奴らの目的だ。
His voice was calm and measured, but we all felt the import of his words.
町に火を放つだ。長州の奴ら、頭のネジが緩んでるんじゃねえの?
He followed his comment with a rude gesture that made her blush involuntarily.
それ単に天使様を誘拐するってことだろ。そんなお掲げてるくせに全然敬ってねえじゃん。
何にしろ見過ごせるものではない。
奴らの会合は今夜行われる可能性が高い。てめえらも出動準備を整えておけ。
了解しました、副長。
よっしゃ、腕が鳴るぜ。
They didn't all display the same level of professionalism, but each man there made it clear that he was prepared. As they quieted down, Hijikata turned towards her as if he had only just noticed her presence.
それから行動さんの件だが、長州の者と松屋に来たことがあるらしい。
But her father was loyal to the shogunate. That's why the Shinsengumi had agreed to help her look for him. But no one had an answer for her. Well, perhaps he got captured. I mean, really. Preparations for the raid began immediately. Within moments, the compound was a beehive of activity, with soldiers and officers running back and forth. The tension was thick enough to cut with a dull knife, and she found it affecting her, despite her best efforts. Her encounter at Masud's had created new problems for them, and she had hoped she might be able to help make up for it. But how was she supposed to prepare for a raid? Help prepare. There was nothing for her to do but sit in her room, though she felt terrible and useless for doing it. Still, she told herself, Best you avoid getting in anyone's way. As she sat there, doing her best to think of something, anything else, she heard voices nearby.
動ける隊士が足りていない。近藤さんの隊は10名で動くそうだ。
俺ら土方さんの隊は24人だったが、隊士の半分が腹痛って笑えないよな。
That didn't seem to be keeping Harada from laughing, though. If she was correct, Kondo would be taking his men to the Ikeda Inn, and Hijikata would be taking his to the Shikoku Inn.
そういえば、あいつらは使わないのか。夜の任務だし、うってつけだと思うんだが。お前らが減らしたけど、まだ何人か残ってるはずだろう。
しばらく実戦から遠ざけるらしい。調整に手間取っていると聞いたが。血に触れるたび、俺たちの指示も聞かずに狂われてはたまらん。
What? She swore she heard something about her reaction to blood before. No. This was something she wasn't supposed to hear. Did they not realize she was there? If they didn't, she could hardly announce her presence after what she'd heard.
奴らも浮かばれねえな。戦うために選んだ道だろう。
佐野、浮かばれないという表現は死んだ者に対して使うものだろ
う。ああ、別に死んでねえよな。むしろめったなことじゃ死なねえし。
There was no doubt that what she was hearing was not meant for her. She shoved her fingers into her ears and closed her eyes tight. The best she could do was make sure she didn't hear anything more.
雪村君、こんなところで何をしているのかね?
Her eyes flew open to see Kondo standing in front of her. She told him the truth about how she'd felt so useless and left her room to find some way to help.
なるほどな。君の気持ちはよくわかる。打ち入り前でみんなも高揚しているしな。
Excited. She would have said bloodthirsty.
どうかね。君も一緒に来るか。
That was not what she'd been expecting him to say.
伝令役になってもらえるとありがたいんだが、もちろん君に無理はさせん。
Of course, the chief was only taking 10 soldiers. Oh, don't even get an option. All right. His face split into a grin, and that was how she found herself on the way to the Ikeda Inn to accompany the Shinsengumi on their raid. After they arrived at Ikeda, she was sent off on several short errands nearby. She returned to hear Nagakura talking to Okida.
こっちが当たりか。まさか長州藩邸のすぐ裏で会合とはな。
僕は最初からこっちだと思ってたけど、奴らは今までも頻繁に池田屋を使ったし。
だからって古高が捕まった晩にわざわざ普段と同じ場所で集まるか？普通は場所を変えるだろう。常識的に考えて。
じゃあ奴らには常識がなかったんだね。実際こうして池田屋で会合してるわけだし。
But for the subject matter, it could have been any conversation between Nagakura and Okida. Perhaps the Chosu were trying to trick the Shinsengumi. She certainly wouldn't have known. Whatever the reason for their behavior, however, it didn't seem to have Nagakura or Okita particularly worried. Words, everybody. Words. Heisuke noticed her as she approached and jogged over.
どうだった？会津藩とか諸次第の役人まだ来てなかった？
He frowned and grunted unhappily to himself.
日暮れ頃にはとっくに連絡してたってのに、まだ動いてないとか何やってんだよ。
落ち着けよ、平助。
The larger man smacked Heisuke playfully on the shoulder with a bark of laughter.
あんな奴ら役に立たねえんだから、来ても来なくても一緒だろ。
だけどさ、新八さん、俺らだけで突入とか無謀だと思わねえの？
His words must have made sense to someone, because they decided to wait for reinforcements. They waited for some time, but they never appeared. She looked up at the sky. The moon had moved to a good part of its way across the sky, since they'd arrived at the Ikeda Inn. Watch that one.
さすがにこれはちょっと遅すぎるな。
近藤さん、どうします？これでミスミス逃しちゃったら無様ですよ。
The chief had been quiet for the last several hours, but when Okita spoke, he stood up and laid his hand on her shoulder.
雪村君、少し池田屋から離れていてくれるか。ここは危険だ。老子が降りてくるかもしれん。もっとも逃がすつもりはないがな。
Then he stood up, gave her a smile, and ran into the inn.
会津中将お預かり老子隊新選組、戦議のため宿内を改める。
The words were scarcely out of his mouth when a cacophony of yells and screams erupted out of the inn.
わざわざ大声で討ち入りを知らせちゃうとか、すごく近藤さんらしいよね。
Cacophony? Okita gave a bark of laughter as he made his own way toward the inn.
いいんじゃねえの？正々堂々名乗りを上げる。それが討ち入りの定石ってもんだ。
自分をわざわざ不利な状況に追い込むのが新八さんの言う定石。
Heisuke and Nagakura grinned at one another as they too sauntered toward the inn.
御用改めでや、手向かいすれば容赦なく切り捨てる。
Then the battle began in earnest. The yells of men and the clang of swords filled the air, rolling out through the doors and windows of the inn. She could hear feet pound upstairs and screams of men dying, the wet thud of bodies dropping onto the floor.
ちくしょう、手が足りねえ。誰か来いよ。おい、誰かいねえのか。
Well, there was someone, but all the men who'd come with the captains had run around to go in the back, and couldn't hear Nagakura. Even if they could have, she heard sounds of the battle coming from the back of the inn as well. The only person left to go help them was her. But even if she did, what could she do? That was when she heard Kondo.
大丈夫か、掃除。
Then Nagakura called out from a different part of the inn.
くそ、死ぬなよ、平助。
She had no desire to go into the building full of men trying their best to kill one another. Even if she did, she had no illusions about her skill with the blade. She was sure to be killed before she'd even drawn it. but she could hardly sit by and do nothing. Perhaps if she couldn't fight, she could rescue the wounded, find them and carry them out of the inn. Her mind made up, she steeled herself and ran inside. Inside, it was pitch black. The smell of fresh blood hit her in the stomach like a fist. The air reeked of it. There were dark lumps on the floor everywhere, the bodies of fallen men. Where were Okita and Heisuke? It had sounded like a good idea at the time, but as she looked around the Charnel house, she realized that there was no way she could possibly carry 2 men outside. Oh, blogger. Really? This is a horrible decision. I like Heisuke, he's entertaining. Okita can probably stand for himself as well. But I kind of want to end game with Okita, so she had decided to look for Okita. She knew she'd cause trouble for him during the afternoon patrols, but he'd never called her out for it. It seemed only fair that she try to return the favor in some way. A Ronin exploded out of nowhere, falling down the stairs and screaming. Her kodachi was in her hand before she'd even realized she'd drawn it. He was halfway up when Kondo's sword slid through his heart. She just watched a man die.
君が来たのか。他の大使は何をやってるんだ。
He did his best to keep his tone calm, but she could tell her appearance had both surprised and worried him.
すまんが、掃除を見てやってくれるか。2階にいるのは掃除と老子が1人だけだ。
Oh, good. Leaving me exactly
掃
where
除
I
に
wanted to
限
go.
って負けはせんだろうが、手傷を負うかもしれん。
That's kind of the same feeling that I had. Yep. She nodded quickly and ran off through the carnage. She took them 2 at a time and landed hard on the top floor. It didn't take long to spot him. Only feet from her was Okita, locked in a battle with a Ronin. She felt her stomach lurch. The cold ring of steel against steel tore through the air, and their blades flashed, lines of light in the darkness. Uh-oh. The strange Ronin's eyes narrowed, and his mouth curved into a smug smile. She'd seen Okita train with the soldiers, and his skill with the blade had been clear. But this Ronin, the way he dodged, parried, and slowly drove Okita back seemed almost lazy.
さて、そろそろ帰らせてもらおう。いらぬ邪魔立てするのであれば容赦せんぞ。
The blood and violence that was choking the inn had no effect on him, it seemed. He was so peaceful, in fact, that he hardly looked as though he belonged in the middle of all that carnage.
悪いけど返せないんだ。僕たちの敵には死んでもらわなくちゃ。
A smile split his face for half a second. Then he launched himself at the Ronin. Their swords slammed together. She hadn't watched them fight for long, but to her untrained eye it looked as though the Ronin was a self-taught swordsman. His sword moved in large, crude arcs, while Okita responded with skill and finesse. In a contest of skill, Okita would have been the clear winner. But, as their blades sprang apart, it was always Okita who found himself pushed back. The Ronin's sword was heavy, but fast. It was clear that he was Okita's superior in raw power. The summer heat had turned the air thick and humid. She could barely breathe. Sweat poured down her spine and beaded on her face as fast as she could wipe it off. This is a decision here. Look around the room. If they could hit him while his guard was down, then perhaps they might be able to escape. That's about what I was looking for. Alright, we'll do it. Once they got down the stairs, Kondo and his men would be there to back them up. She glanced around the room, and then she saw him. One of the Ronin who'd been struck down earlier and left for dead was still alive. His face was pale and waxy already, but his knuckles were white with strain as he pulled himself to his feet, sword in hand. Okita hadn't noticed him. Without even bothering to look at her, Okita spun around to face the half-dead Ronin.
死に損ないは黙って寝てろよ
Even as he spoke, Okita's sword flickered out, slashing across the wounded man. This time, he didn't get back up. A man had just died because of her, but if she hadn't said anything, that would have been Okita lying motionless on the floor. She couldn't have let that happen.
こちらに背を向けるとは俺も随分と舐められたものだな
The strange Ronin's sword whipped through the air, little more than a silvery blur. Okita caught each blow as best as he could, but a particularly powerful strike from above was too much for his skill to counter, and he stumbled. Well, that guy's gonna get away. Though he might not have shared Okita's skill, the Ronin was no fool, and Okita had given him an opening even a child could exploit. The Ronin's foot connected with the center of Okita's chest. Whatever the source of his tremendous strength was, it apparently extended to his legs as well as his sword arm. She thought she heard a wet crunch as the kick connected, and Okita tumbled across the floor of the room. When at last he stopped, she saw him grip his chest with one hand and cough. Blood. She leapt across the room. His face was tight with pain, and the most he seemed to be able to manage were labored gasps and wet, tearing coughs. Okita was in no condition to fight. As she struggled to move herself under his arm to lift him up, she glared at the strange Ronin.
お前も邪魔立てする気か俺の相手をするというのなら受けて立つが
She watched the tip of his blade drift up to point straight at her. With a groan of pain, Okita lifted himself up and stumbled between her and the Ronin. There was a good chance he had broken bones, and if he was coughing up blood, then his internal organs could be damaged as well. He could barely stand, let alone fight, and he had to have known it just as well as she did. But he stood firm.
あんたの相手は僕だよね。この子には手を出さないでくれるかな。
The Ronin sneered.
愚かな。その負傷で何を言う。今の貴様なぞ盾の役にも立つまい。
黙れようるさいな。僕は役立たずなんかじゃない。
As he shouted, new flecks of blood appeared on Okita's lips. The Ronin regarded them with cool, disinterested eyes for a few moments. Then in one smooth motion lifted his sword and slid it home into his scabbard. Oh, good. Okay. Well, Okita's not gonna die.
会合が終わるとともに俺の務めも終わっている。
His voice was as cool and aloof as his eyes. He lifted one foot to the broken windowsill and leapt out into the thick night air. No, he hadn't run. He was letting them go.
くそ。僕はまだ戦えるのに。
His voice was weak. Okita turned his head to look at her. So why had he protected her? He raised a shaky eyebrow.
そういえば、なんでだろう。
His words were already beginning to slur.
僕にもよくわからないけど、でも次はちゃんと殺さないと。
His eyes fluttered, and his body sort of folded as he collapsed to the floor. She'd been so worried about Okita, she hadn't noticed. The sounds of screaming men and clattering swords had disappeared. The words were out of her mouth. She heard the sound of labored footsteps on the stairs. That looked like a good stopping point to me. So, we'll see you next time for more story time of the Shinsengumi. Till then, bye-bye.